Good morning. This is a lesson for Tuesday, April 14th. This is the beginning of our final unit before our final exam. Hope you guys had a great weekend and survived the stormy weather safely. This is going to be the beginning of a unit in which you will be writing an argumentative essay. You've written an essay that was kind of a basic argumentative essay when you did the cause and effect. So you're going to be using a lot of the same skills that you used in that essay for this one. I'll be giving you a list of topics to choose from on Thursday of this week so that you can get started. And on Thursday, we'll be talking more about getting sources, reviewing that a little bit. I'll also provide you with some sources. We often talk about argumentative essays and persuasive essays as if they're the same thing, and they kind of are. Argumentative essays are a kind of persuasive essays, but in school you may have been able to write persuasive essays sometimes that were just kind of opinion essays, what you thought, and in fact your final exam is going to be more of a persuasive essay like that, in which you kind of argue for something just based on the fact that you like it. Anyway, I'll tell you more about that as the time approaches. But this essay is going to rely a lot on logic and evidence. So when we talk about an argumentative essay, that's generally what we mean. One that really relies heavily on logic and research and the evidence you find in your research. There are different sorts of arguments that you can present. One kind of argument might be to persuade somebody that a problem exists in the world. For example, you might argue that many drug companies charge unfair prices for their medications. Or you might argue the rightness or wrongness of something. For example, you could argue everyone should have the right to affordable health care. Another thing you might argue is that someone should change the way they behave or something that they believe. For example, you might argue people should be required to buy health insurance the way they are required to buy car insurance. Or you might argue that people should take some kind of action, or that maybe even the whole country should. For example, you could argue the United States should negotiate with drug companies to bring down prices the way other countries do. An argumentative paper makes a claim, that is, it has a thesis statement that is specific and meaningful and with which some people will disagree. It's going to be somewhat controversial. So I have a selection of possible thesis statements here, and I think you'll see right away that some of them are more specific and meaningful than others. For example, number one, teenagers are lazy and disrespectful would not be a very good thesis statement. On the other hand, excessive cell phone use is causing more teens to lack social skills and have short attention spans would be more appropriate. It's something that you could argue, that you could actually prove. Number three, pepperoni pizza is better than sausage pizza. Well, it depends on who you are and whether or not you like pepperoni better than sausage. It's a lousy thesis statement, but you could argue that a specific pizza parlor's pizza is more authentic and made with better ingredients than pizza at local chain restaurants. You could argue that states should tax unhealthy foods such as sodas, fries, and pizza, just as they tax tobacco and alcohol. Obviously, a lot of people would not agree with that, but you could argue that. Whereas the statement that everyone should eat healthy foods yeah, but it's not a very good thesis statement. An argument essay discusses the reasons that your claim or thesis is correct and provides evidence that it is correct. So suppose you had a thesis statement that the federal government should regulate pharmaceutical prices to prevent excessive profit taking, which threatens the lives and financial well-being of citizens. Then you might have paragraphs that cover reasons for that. One reason could be some pharmaceutical companies have shown they cannot be trusted to charge fair prices. Then you might argue when the government gets involved, prices come down. You could argue people are suffering and sometimes dying because they cannot afford their medications. And you could certainly find evidence for all of those things. When you're trying to support your reasons, prove that your reasons are correct, you want to have specific statements like those that I just read. And then your evidence is going to include facts, of course, statistics, statements made by experts or witnesses. So if you have an expert's opinion, then that's worth something versus just the opinion of, somebody down the street who doesn't know anything about the medical industry. But also observed examples and descriptions of actual events that occur. Another thing that effective argumentation does is it addresses any opposing arguments and it makes realistic arguments. So a strong argumentative essay would include refutation. Refutation, sometimes called a counter-argument, identifies opposing arguments, explains how those arguments are unsound, unfair, or inaccurate, perhaps. Sometimes an effective argument will actually make a concession. It will acknowledge that there are opposing viewpoints that have merit, that are true, and then will explain, nevertheless, that your current argument has more merit. When you make claims, it's a good idea to qualify those. Don't make extreme claims. That's why I say your arguments should be realistic. So use terms that admit limitations to your claim. Instead of suggesting that everything is this way, you might say some, or most, or often, or usually, or if this happens, or when this happens. For example, one of my statements for a topic sentence is some pharmaceutical companies have shown they cannot be trusted to charge fair prices. It doesn't suggest that all pharmaceutical companies can't be trusted. There are different kinds of logic that we use when we're arguing a case in our essay. And I'm going to ask you to practice a couple of these in one of the assignments I'm giving you today. One type of logic is deductive reasoning. It's a kind of logical formula called a syllogism in which a major premise is stated. This is a general fact that pretty much everyone would agree with. You'd start with that, and then you would state a related minor premise that includes a specific fact, and make a claim that if you believe these two facts, then you must also believe a third factual conclusion. For example, kind of a classic syllogism is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Another type of logic is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning you use in science. So you form a hypothesis and then you go out and you collect evidence and see if your hypothesis is proven true. So you can do that also when you're writing an argumentative essay. So you would present a question to be answered, or basically you would make a claim that you believe is true, and then you would present several points of evidence so that each of those points help add up to a conclusion that your claim is true. There's another type of logic called the Toulmin logic, and it's kind of like a combination of both of those things in a way. It starts out with a claim, it states its conclusion first, and then it states it's what Toulmin called the grounds, the premises or evidence that prove the claim is true or reasonable, and then he said you've closed with a warrant, an inference or assumption that connects the grounds to the claim. So an example of Toulmin logic would be a claim, we should get a dog that chases rabbits. So that's his, would be the premise. And then the grounds, rabbits are eating the plants in our garden. They leave footprints and rabbit pellets everywhere. Our green peas have been nibbled to the ground. And then the warrant would connect the grounds to the claim. If we had a rabbit chasing dog, rabbits would be afraid to come into the garden. It's important when you're writing to try to avoid logical fallacies. Logical fallacies abound in our culture. They abound on social media. They abound in anytime there are politicians talking, they abound. And we just kind of generally can be kind of careless, especially in conversation. But when we're writing, we have to be a little more careful, a little pickier. One kind of logical fallacy is begging the question. And that's really just using a circular argument so that you try to use your claim as the proof for itself in a way. So it's a circular argument that assumes a premise is true without actually proving it. Oftentimes the statement will include loaded language, and loaded language is kind of language that has sort of emotional or real bias behind it. For example, a statement like pharmaceutical prices must be controlled because pharmaceutical executives are greedy and uncaring would be one that begs the question. You can't just assume that all pharmaceutical executives are greedy and uncaring. If you made a claim like that, that would have to be proven. So you can't use that as the cause or the proof for pharmaceutical prices needing to be controlled. Ad hominem means personal attack. Another form is to coke you also. These are two forms in which instead of arguing the claim, a person just attacks the other person making the claim instead of attacking the argument itself. That's obviously not cool. Appeals to doubtful authority. So just quoting somebody, maybe because that person is well known, a celebrity or something, doesn't make that person an expert or worthy of believing. So that would be a doubtful authority. And your book gives this example of Jenny McCarthy as somebody who claims autism is caused by childhood vaccines. She's a model and like celebrity, so she really has no authority there in terms of being a scientist or a doctor. Misleading statistics are something to look out for. So if you find some interesting statistics, look at who the source is. Make sure it's someone who is careful with that sort of thing. Organizations that have a bias are really bad to use misleading statistics. They can easily sound more impressive than they really are. For example, someone might boast he's in the top 10% of his class when his class only has 20 students in it. That wouldn't be very impressive. Versus top 10 in your class, if your class has 300 or so in it. Other logical fallacies include jumping to conclusions. A lot of books call that hasty generalizations. That's when you take an insignificant sample of something as proof that it's true. Like if you have an example of, one or two people who do a certain thing, and then you kind of extrapolate from that to suggest that everyone does that. So, if I said, my son likes to play the banjo. All teenagers like to play the banjo. Yeah, that wouldn't make any sense, would it? We'd be jumping to conclusions. A false dilemma is one of kind of my pet peeves. I see that people do this a lot. They sort of suggest that you have to believe either this one thing or this other thing, when oftentimes there are a lot of choices in between they just don't mention. It's also sometimes called black and white thinking. So suggesting that one must choose between two things when in reality there are a range of choices is false dilemma. An example would be saying Americans must choose between universal health care and capitalism. There's still a lot of room for a lot of capitalism if the nation chose to have universal health care. There's probably even some choice for some capitalism within the universal health care. Red herring is shifting the focus of an argument to distract the audience from the real issue. For example, if someone came to me and said, I know my paper is late, but I got my math assignment done on time. Well, that doesn't really, getting your math assignment done on time doesn't really matter to me one way or the other. I just want your English paper done on time. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore, because of this, is the idea that because this one thing happened, and then afterwards this other thing happened, it's arguing the first thing caused the second thing, which is not necessarily true. Superstitions that we see some of our sports heroes claim to kind of fall in this category. So if somebody argued, we won the baseball game when I wore my St. Jude's medal, who's the patron saint of lost causes. We lost when I didn't wear it. If I wear my medal today, we will win. That would be post hoc ergo propter hoc. So this is where we'll stop with the presentation today, and I have a quiz. It covers some of the things in your presentation, but all of the answers are also in your chapter, so I'm hoping you read that. And then, of course, the exercise, which asks you to answer, to write a couple of paragraphs arguing for or against certain topics, and using deductive reasoning for one and inductive for another.